everyone. Welcome to our adult Bible class. On this Sunday, we'll be studying different songs that are found outside of the Psalter on Sunday mornings. And today's assignment is going to be taken from Habakkuk chapter 3, if you'd like to start turning there. It's an important thing to note that the songs of Israel that were sung in the praise of God and to encourage and to exhort fellow Jews and fellow believers was not always found in the psalm book. That it was written in the prophets, or the prophets' record of it in the history books like Kings and Chronicles, allow us to see that praise and music was part of their daily life. It was the way that they learned to, or that they chose, maybe not learned, but they chose to express themselves in the praise of God. It's making realization that life creates opportunities for praise. It certainly cretes opportunities for petition, but that should be for us a great lesson about the way that you and I, and the purpose of this series, to learn that praising God and petitioning Him isn't something that's found inside the four squares of a church building. It is indeed a most holy place, but it is a place where we gather together as a group to worship. But these worship experiences that we're going to be covering through the summer, particularly on these Sundays, is bringing to that awareness, that truth, that where we are is a great place to praise God. So we talk about Habakkuk, who was likely a contemporary of Nahum and Zephaniah, and they have much in common, that each one of them approach how God deals with humanity through the government of men in a different way. They come from this same time period of roughly 640 BC to around 598 BC, that spans the reigns of Josiah to Jehoiakim. And they would have been contemporaries of Jeremiah, and Habakkuk would have been too. So whether they knew each other is unknown. We don't really know that. But Israel has already gone into captivity when we read about Habakkuk's song, and Judah is on the brink of being captured. And after Josiah, the southern kingdom's leadership, the kings that they have, just go from bad to worse. So the political, moral, and religious decline of the nation was clearly in place. The leadership was corrupt. The people were devouring each other, and it was not a beautiful picture for the nation in which this conversation between God and Habakkuk occurs. Also, what's unique about Habakkuk is that he's an awful lot like Jonah, that the book is not really about God's judgment upon the nations and how that's executed by God through prophecy, but rather it is a book about the prophet and God. Jonah is dealing with God and how God is interacting with Nineveh. And now we come to Habakkuk, who is questioning and challenging and perhaps even complaining. Some have put those kind of emotive connections to his words, complaining to God. First, that perhaps God is overlooking the sin of the nation, but then when God answers with what his objectives and purposes will be through Babylon, Habakkuk doesn't like that narrative. He doesn't like that point. Why would you use Babylon, a nation more wicked, more pagan, and more given to idolatry, to bring your people to holiness? But the book is very important in our understanding as a Christian. Every book in the New Testament that is regarded to be high in its doctrinal content, the book of Romans, the book of Galatians, and the book of Hebrews, I'll quote from Habakkuk, particularly chapter 2, verse 4, "The just shall live by faith, And even in our study of Romans recently, we captured in the voice of Habakkuk what it was that Paul was arguing about, how the just should live by faith, that God has always justified people by faith, and the relationship that it has in fulfilling that in Messiah. But Habakkuk doesn't tell us much about his personal life. He even really doesn't say much about the era of his time, because it's about God's interaction with Habakkuk's questions. But we know what's going on historically because of the time frame that Habakkuk identifies. But the little book that we're not going to read all the book, but chapter 3. But chapter 1 begins in sort of a gloom. Habakkuk is gloomy, and then as he finishes in the song, he moves from fright to future glory. He moves from gloom to faith. It begins, you could say, with a question mark and closes with an exclamation point of trust. So the theme of Habakkuk, which is faith, the great statement that we already referred to, the just shall live by his faith, is, I think, sort of key, not only to understanding the climate in which Habakkuk lived, but understanding the conclusion to which the book reaches, concluding with this song, moving from burdens to blessings, moving from worry to worship, moving from complaint to consolation. Only God can do that for us. And Habakkuk moves in the song through many emotions that humans would experience and understand as he reflects on those emotions in the context of the history that he narrates in the song, which we'll talk about when we read it. And some other people, while I'm not a Hebrew scholar or anything, have commented on the poetry of this particular song in Habakkuk, describing it as distinguished, magnificent. Delitzsch even wrote, his language is classical throughout, full of rare and select turns and words. But this look at the song, we're not going to get in technical in all of those aspects, but really an application, noting that this song is noted in verse 1 of chapter 3, a prayer of Habakkuk, the prophet, according to the Shigionoth. Shigionoth, say that 75 times fast. In the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, those translators translated that word as ode, what you and I would think of as song. So even though it is a prayer as it starts off, then it is identified as a prayer that was to be sung, which in our culture and experience in churches isn't common. We sing songs that are prayers, but we never think of singing our prayers. But this is a prayer that was written to be sung. What's also interesting is the New American Standard puts a note on that word by saying, quote, "It is a highly emotional, poetic form," end quote, of song. That's why the Amplified Version, when it gives that note, describes it as a wild, passionate song with rapid changes of rhythm, end quote. And recognizing that this isn't critical to our understanding. But listen to the way that you pray. And listen to the way that you pray when you're anxious or worried or restless. Wouldn't your speed of language change from time to time and get really slow while you're talking? And as you're thinking about your anxious thoughts, you would speed up again. It doesn't seem unbelievable to think that as the Amplified Version, realizing, of course, its nature as a translation or amplification, is still, I think, giving us insight into what that word ode really was, because not all songs are the same. But it is a technical term that the New American Standard even acknowledges as highly emotive, a highly emotional poetic form. So, in a study of Habakkuk, we would remember that what that name has been regarded to say is embracer, where people like Spurgeon from a long time ago would say he truly was one who saw the promises afar off and was persuaded of them and embraced them. He took fast hold upon the goodness of the Lord and rested there. So this embracer embraces his environment and the emotions that it created in him, and the emotions that caused him to question what God was doing, to complain to God about what he was doing, and then to rest himself in trust with God's answer. You know, when you look at our own life, and I want you to read it with that, I guess, in context, that Israel's history isn't ours, and we are not modern Israel, and we are not God's chosen nation as Judah was either. But national insecurity is universal. It doesn't matter if you're God's unique nation. If you have senses and emotions of national insecurity, and guess what? I think most of us have some of those feelings surging through our veins right now because of everything going on in this year 2020. We sometimes have thought of this year as the great year of vision ahead of us, and we were sidelined in the middle of March, and here we are, still really uncertain of the future. I think that hits really close to what Habakkuk felt. And the prophet tells us what God told him. By faith will you live to be righteous, or the righteous man shall live by his faith. So, read with me chapter 3, this song of Habakkuk. Lord, I have heard the report about you, and I fear. O Lord, revive thy work in the midst of the years. In the midst of the years, make it known. In wrath, remember mercy. God comes from Teman, and the Holy One from Mount Paran. His splendor covers the heavens, and the earth is full of his praise. His radiance is like the sunlight. He has rays flashing from his head, and there is the hiding of his power. Before him goes pestilence, and plague comes after him. He stood and surveyed the earth. He looked and startled the nations. Yes, the perpetual mountains were shattered. The ancient hills collapsed. His ways are everlasting. I saw the tents of Cushan under distress. The tent curtains of the land of Midian trembled. Did the Lord rage against the rivers, or was thine anger against the rivers? Or was thy wrath against the sea, that thou didst ride on thy horses, on thy chariots of salvation? Thy bow was made bare, the rods of chastisement were sworn. Thou didst cleave the earth with rivers. The mountains saw thee and quaked. The downpour of waters swept by. The deep uttered forth its voice. It lifted high its hands. Sun and moon stood in their places. Sun and moon stood in their places. They went away at the light of your arrows, at the radiance of your gleaming spear. In indignation thou didst march through the earth. In anger thou didst trample the nations. Thou didst go forth for the salvation of your people, for the salvation of thine anointed. Thou didst strike the head of the house of the evil, to lay him open from thigh to neck. Thou didst pierce with his own spears the head of his throngs. They stormed in to scatter us. Their exultation was like those who devour the oppressed in secret. Thou didst tread on the sea with thy horses, on the surge of many waters. I heard, and my inward parts trembled. At the sound, my lips quivered, decay entered my bones, and in my place I tremble. Because I must wait quietly for the day of distress, for the people to arise who will invade us. Though the fig tree should not blossom, and there be no fruit on the vines, though the yield of the olive should fail, and the fields produce no food, though the flock should be cut off from the fold, and there be no cattle in the stalls, yet I will exult in the Lord. I will rejoice in the God of my salvation. The Lord God is my strength, and he has made my feet like hinds' feet, and makes me walk on my high places. For the choir director, on my stringed instruments. To me, it's a moving song that begins with this introductory part, if you call it that really is a prayer, a petition. It's also important to notice that in verse 2, in the prayer, I have heard the report about you, and I fear. And then in verse 16, he said, I heard, and my inward parts trembled. This is not a worshiper who's sitting on top of the clouds. This is a worshiper who feels the burden of his existence in a troubled world, where his people will suffer, his people will be harmed, they will be judged, and things may fall apart around him. And so he says, but I will exult in the Lord and rejoice in the God who is my strength and makes me walk on my high places. Two things he says in the prayer part of this song at the beginning, or petitions, I guess I could call it instead of prayer. The first petition that he says, O Lord, revive your work in the midst of the years. In the midst of the years, make it known. Now, in the midst of the years, it just seems pretty straightforward, even though one commentary said, not sure what this means, it only happens here. The wording only happens here, but perhaps the point is, revive your work, make it known in the middle of this, in the midst of these years. And if the point is that he's saying years because he understands it will take much time, then that again elongates that truth, that trust is an ongoing reality, and God doesn't bring instantaneous, drop the sponge in the water and boom, suddenly you have blessing. It's the elongated reality of what life really is. But he says, revive your work, make it known. This intervention that he pleads with God to engage in is, in the midst of all of this, revive your work. We may get to the end of the work, and God will oftentimes describe his people as a work in progress, or even Isaiah 43 verse 1 describes God's people in this way, illustrating that he is full of power, full of wisdom, and full of goodness. Even the psalmist captures that same wording in Psalm 85 verse 6. Though we seem as it were dead nationally, revive us, a modern translation says. So thy work, I think, is a reference on the part of Habakkuk to the nation. And so he petitions God to revive your work. Now, how could the nation of Israel be God's work? Well, you and I should know that the promises of Abraham articulate how Israel would come into play and purpose for God to accomplish his mission to save the world through Messiah, through Jesus. And the prayer realizes in the petition let me reword that. The words of the prayer will be realized as a harbinger of what Jesus Christ will ultimately accomplish. How much of the knowledge that Habakkuk had in saying this is unknown, but God would revive his work, that Israel would be taken into captivity, or Judah would be taken into captivity, and would later return and rebuild until Messiah comes, so that Messiah would restore all things, as Acts 4 would reference. But this idea of reviving is give life to, help it live, restore the life to it. That can't be relived, that can't be realized in the mere act of them going back to the land. It's ultimately going to be realized in Messiah. What Habakkuk knew about it, a note in the song, in my mind. But the fact that he says it means that Habakkuk had faith that God could revive his work. And revive your work and make it known. And that's exactly what God would do. Habakkuk does not put in place the predetermined plan of God. God had already set that in motion. But Habakkuk's prayer reflects a believer's confidence that God was going to be able to do whatever he chose to do. The second thing he makes in this petition is, in wrath, remember mercy. In wrath, remember mercy. The wrath of God, often unspoken in today's pulpits, is just. And so Habakkuk sees that the justness of God in bringing the judgment to captivity ultimately is justice realized. But he petitions the God that he knows. Just like Jonah knew who God was. Jonah knew God would have mercy. Isn't this what I said you would do? You were going to let these Ninevites off the hook. Habakkuk knows God is a merciful God. So in your justice, show mercy. Or in your wrath, I should say, show your mercy. And so this fear of the coming judgment of God is certainly genuine. But the knowledge of who God's true character is equally genuine. Because he wouldn't petition of God something like, remember mercy in your wrath, if he didn't expect in God showing wrath, he could also show mercy. Even Jeremiah in chapter 3, verse 32 says, for if God causes grief, he will then have compassion according to his abundant loving kindness. So Habakkuk has come to that realization in the song to show what this life experience has taught him as he watches Babylon come. Then when we get to the next section, verses 3 through 15, which I just kind of call God's ways are everlasting, coming from the statement, verse 6, his ways are everlasting. That what he seems to keep articulating, referencing the Exodus as a mark point for Israel to understand the God that they're serving, and Habakkuk probably acknowledging that this is what I really understand about the God that I'm serving. Look at who he was in verse 3 and verse 4. Never before, never has God shown us who he really is than he did at our beginning as a nation. Going to Egypt with 10 plagues, powers that demonstrated his sovereignty over every god of Egypt, especially Pharaoh, and setting the prisoner free and marching them to the land he had promised their great patriarch Abraham. Yes, a generation passes before they ultimately get there by their own transgression. But God demonstrates his power, and more than anything else, shows the people who he is, even revealing himself in power at Mount Sinai once the law is finally given. All of that Exodus event is alluded to in all of the language of Habakkuk's song, like his splendor covers the heavens, his earth is full of praise. Before him goes pestilence, verse 5, and plague comes after him. The ancient hills collapse, the perpetual mountains are shattered. The tents of Cushan under distress, the curtains of the land of Midian. All references perhaps in Numbers chapter 12, verse 1, if you want to look there. Certainly in the book of Judges, which is certainly after those events, understood, could be another reference to Cushan and Midian. But he's worthy of that praise because of what he has done. And then talking about waters, the Lord rages against rivers. Or was thy wrath against the sea, that thou didst ride on horses, on your chariots of some horses and chariots? Where do we read about that? When Pharaoh's armies are engulfed in the Red Sea. Notice also in verse 13, thou didst strike the head of the house of the evil to lay him open from thigh to neck. Thou didst pierce with his own spear the head of his throngs. They stormed in to scatter us. With exhortation was like those who devour the opposed in secret. And thou didst tread on the sea with your horses on the surge of many waters. And when you go back to that event, God divided the water for the people to escape and brought that water back down upon the Egyptians. God's ways are everlasting. He's worthy of praise because of his power. He divided waters. And also in verse 11, not talking, I think, about the Exodus event, but still, sun and moon stood in their places. They went away at the light of your arrows, at the radiance of your gleaming spear. That not only can God have control over waters, sun and moon stood in their place. Verse 12 through 15, someone who can do that, whose ways are everlasting, can be our judge. Habakkuk realizes. And I just want to hasten to add, Babylon will face the judgment of God too. But Babylon is not God's unique people. Every nation faces God's judgment, including ours. And when that will be, God doesn't reveal. But what this song of Habakkuk should show you and me as believers is that there's a song we must sing when judgment is real. So we finished the last bit of the song, beginning at verse 16. I heard, verse 16 in the middle, I tremble. And at the end of verse 16, I must wait quietly for the day of distress. So he comes to the realization that it's time for him to admit or to accept what it is that God has planned for the judgment of the nation. He had to trust God as he awaited the destruction of his people, and perhaps even as he witnessed it. And he said, describing it in a powerful way. Decay enters my bones, and in my place I tremble. This is a believer whose confidence in God doesn't take away his trembling, but his confidence in God is going to cause him, verse 18, to rejoice. I will exult in the Lord. I will rejoice in the God of my salvation, because the Lord God is my strength. His journey of faith for Habakkuk is very much like our own. We have to realize that when we see God's ways, they are everlasting. He is worthy of praise. Only He has shown Himself as He has to Israel and ultimately through Christ to us. He's divided waters. He's stopped sun and moon in their tracks. And He's judge of all. So in my trembling I must wait, Habakkuk said, and in my joy I must praise. The everlasting God is my everlasting strength. So when you come to that application, this is about the glory of God. Habakkuk has to surrender that while he doesn't understand all that God has accomplished and will accomplish through Babylon, God, the Holy One, ultimately who would be Jesus, will bring His people, as He said at the beginning, mercy, and He will bring His work, revival. A well-known quote from Corrie ten Boom, which is a great little subtitle for Habakkuk 3 and really sums up in a lot of ways I see this song, is that if you look at the world, you'll be distressed. If you look within, you'll be depressed. But if you look up to God, you'll be at rest. And that's where faith brings us the peace and the comfort and the joy amidst awful circumstances, horrific realities. And Habakkuk trusted God. And this song shows how we can sing the same song in our same culture of trouble and society of unease, because God will always be more than enough, and God will always be everlasting, and the everlasting God can be your everlasting strength. Thanks for joining me for this class. I hope it's been helpful to you. Looking forward to studying again with you next Sunday. Another song outside the Psalms. May God bless you.